Well, I finally finished the book, and it was a hard read. I'm not going to say a whole lot about it, but I found in the epilogue, which really served as the last chapter in this book, some information that I was not really aware of, because I'm a student of history and I knew the founding of the Plymouth Plantation was that it was a community that had a church at its heart, and everyone in the community was expected to be a part of the activities of the church. It's been assumed by many, and it's been taught by some, that from that point actually forward that the United States had become a Christian nation, which is not an accurate statement or assessment. It's been influenced. Our founding documents, the things that have shaped our culture historically, were the product of Judeo-Christian ethics and belief systems. Most of the founding fathers, the signers of the Declaration of Independence, were not professing Christians. They were deists. They did believe in God, but really in a God of their own understanding or their own making. So the assumptions about the influence of Christianity on us historically have not been accurately reported. And one of the things that Tom Rogerson did was, in the epilogue, he writes these words to sort of tie together his thinking and his purpose about this category of people in our culture that consider themselves nuns. If you were to break down the sort of the religious preferences of the people here, that in the past, many of them would have checked one of the available boxes. Increasingly, people are picking the last one that's offered to them, which is none of the above. And so that's the group that Tom Rogerson is addressing. So in trying to summarizing things and why have things become like they have, he gives us a little bit of statistical data. So let me just share this paragraph out of his epilogue. He said, "The basic fact that something is happening is not all that unusual or remarkable. If we ask why something is happening, the simple answer is because things are always happening. It is part of a creative system that is alive. It is inherent in the being of creation. Even if we look at what is happening by the numbers, namely, with the percentage increase of you as nuns in the general population, it is not particularly unusual or remarkable and may simply be a recalibration of what has always been. As Robert Putnam points out, at the time of the Revolution, talking about the American Revolution, fewer than 1 in 5 Americans were members of any religious body, and the figure had risen to only 34% by 1850. He goes on to say that by the end of the 19th century, most Americans in their daily lives were unchurched or churchless. Like contemporary religious nuns, those who professed no religious identity, these secular Americans were not necessarily unbelievers, but they were unattached to religious institutions by membership, attendance, or contributions. In 1910, it was reported by some that only 43% of the total population claimed any church affiliation. And the Washington Post article in 1909 offered a very similar estimate that the unchurched population in America probably outnumbered our church members in the proportion of about 3 to 1. What may be remarkable in American history was the dramatic increase in religious affiliation that reached nearly 80% in the late 1950s. The tsunami of religious involvement during the 1950s was massive, reaching levels probably unrivaled in American history. I admitted to you last week that our time, at least while I'm not having opportunity to preach in a local church and record that and provide that, sort of the teaching, preaching experience, that this is becoming more of a personal spiritual journal for me, between me and you, taking the things that I'm reading and seeing and thinking about and processing and presenting it to you in this format. And it is an unusual format for me, I admit to that. And so this is really where it is. I'm reading. I've got a number of books. I went to Ollie's the other day and purchased some more to have something in the background, but I'm trying to finish those things that I've started. And because of my interest historically in reaching unchurched people, which accounts for why in this season of my life we have this ministry called Rebirthing the Church, because I realize that most churches in my lifetime have been very ineffective at reaching, even acknowledging the unchurched people. And a lot of it has to do with the statistics that I just read. That during the 1950s, which is where I began life, is that upwards of 80% of the American population was somehow connected with some religious organization or entity. You'd be hard-pressed to determine what percentage of those would be described as New Testament Christians or as Christ followers. We can't determine that, but the fact that 80% were involved at this level in some sort of form of religious expression of their lives sort of accounts for why the churches that some of us grew up in weren't particularly focused on reaching the unchurched, because it represented such a small minority of the general population. The shame is that should have been an encouragement to say, with such a small percentage, we should be able to share the gospel with every one of them, but that was not the case. Churches were having sort of their healthy experience by people in attendance, by the giving, by the buying land and building buildings, and the influence and culture. You and I have seen the role that religious entities have played in politics in the last 60 years. Some for better and some for worse, and we're not removed from that. And so in this season of my life, to try to find those churches that are struggling with having lost traction, that frankly I'm not sure they ever had over their lifetime because of the assumption that so many people were already a part of the faith system, that we have a desire and design, because I know it's still, the church is the principal vehicle. It is the spiritual environment and context. It's called the body of Christ that is talked about all through the New Testament, and we're supposed to be a part of, actively engaged in sharing the gospel and living in our faith in conjunction with other people. It is sharing the life, experience, and challenge of following Christ together. And our understanding of Scripture is that a high priority in that environment and context should be making Christ known. Living out our faith, that is, having Christ be reproduced in us and our character and our conduct and our conversations, so much so that we engage other people that they might know as well. And the church has failed miserably. Now, not all churches, some have done quite well, but it's a small minority that have done so. And so in my continuing learning and reading, I'm reading this material. And the reason I was invited to read this, I shared last week, was that Tom, the author of this book, is a friend of mine. And because he was aware of our ministry in Maryland, and by desire and design that we were reaching unchurched people. And had they been surveyed, prior to our engagement with them, many of them would probably have considered themselves none of the above in all the represented categories. So we reached those people, or they were drawn to us, and we reached those that typically wouldn't be found in anybody else's church on any given Sunday or any given weekend. So I've read this, and I reached out to him having completed this, and asked him when he was available to chat. So tomorrow, my time, I'm supposed to call him, and we'll have a conversation about this. But given the purpose of this was to identify the challenge we have with a culture that is increasingly comfortable with being none of the above. There is no apparent advantage socially or culturally for people anymore to identify with a given, unless in certain places for political reasons. In the Bible Belt and in the Deep South, then if you hold the views that are held by the conservative churches in your area, you're more likely to get elected to public office, but not as much so anymore. And so it's within that framework. And with reading, I'm wrapping up 2 Chronicles now, challenging reading as well. And it's causing me to think about this stuff and to think about more things going on around us that have to do with what we're attempting to accomplish here. And I'm going to read a brief passage out of 2 Chronicles chapter 30. And I might have to frame it a little bit, and we're going to back up because I have a number of images I'm going to be looking at and sharing with you to sort of talk about some of what I see taking place in our culture that is very, very, very unpleasant to think about or to talk about, but it has to be confronted because of the risk we stand in losing the blessing of God on us beyond just that at a personal level. So reading 2 Chronicles chapter 30, beginning in verse 13. Now many people were gathered at Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread in the second month, a very large assembly. They got up and removed the altars which were in Jerusalem. They also removed all the incense altars and threw them in the brook Kidron. Then they slaughtered the Passover lambs on the 14th of the second month, and the priests and Levites were ashamed of themselves and consecrated themselves and brought burnt offerings to the house of the Lord. They stood at their stations following their custom, according to the law of Moses, the man of God. The priests sprinkled the blood which they received from the hand of the Levites. For there were many in the assembly who had not consecrated themselves. Therefore the Levites were in charge of the slaughter of the Passover lambs for everyone who was unclean, in order to consecrate them to the Lord. For a multitude of the people, many from Ephraim and Manasseh and Issachar and Zebulun, had not purified themselves, yet they ate the Passover, contrary to what was written. For Hezekiah prayed for them, saying, May the good Lord pardon everyone who prepares his heart to seek God, the Lord God of our fathers, though not according to the purification rules of the sanctuary. So the Lord heard Hezekiah and healed the people. There's far too much background to go into in the time allotted for our purposes together. But to suffice it to say that in all my years of reading through the Bible, it's this section of Scripture that has been somewhat challenging, because we're in that season where we've moved past Israel becoming a nation, Israel occupying the land, Israel being operating under a number of judges before they finally had a king, and then this whole succession of kings, both over a united kingdom and divided kingdom. And the united kingdom was simple. Saul was the first, David was the second, Solomon was the third, and then after that we had a divided kingdom for the rest of Old Testament history. And if you've read through this, you realize that the northern kingdom, which became known as Israel in that part of the Old Testament, and the southern kingdom, which was, the capital was at Jerusalem, became known as Judah. The northern kingdom of Israel, their capital was Samaria. That you have in a staggered formation, both through the Kings and through Chronicles. You have some parallel information there that some of it tracks simply in alignment, others it's simply additional information or less information. And one of the challenges you have is we have named the kings in each one of those succeeding kingdoms. You know, the king of the southern kingdom, the king of the northern kingdom, and then they simply overlapped. And one of the things that you read about in there is what the spiritual state of the nation was, or any one of those kingdom was, primarily based on who the king was. Either the king did, quote, that which was right in the eyes of the Lord, or they did not do that which was right in the eyes of the Lord. By and large, the northern kingdom, where Samaria was the capital, having a godly king was not in the history. The southern kingdom, where Jerusalem was the capital, where the temple was, where the Levites came together in supporting the ministry there, it had both. It had a number of those that were considered men that did that which was right according to the Lord, and then it had those that did not. And they're mixed and matched. And strangely enough, as you read this, you realize that you can have a godly king, as identified and recognized there because of the things he did and the things that he emphasized. his support of the temple, of the priesthood, of the Levites, of the Mosaic Law. And then immediately following that, you could have a king that was not a godly king. I don't know about you, but that strikes me as odd. And I think it's simply explained by the fact that the king had very little to do with raising the children that he produced. They were all polygamous, which means they had multiple wives, which means they had multiple children. And historically, the oldest son would be the one who would succeed the throne, but that was not always the case. And you had a lot of bloodsheds there between brothers and sisters in the same family following the kings. And the influence on the king was primarily through the mother or the relationship with the high priest during that season. And when you come to this stage, we're talking about in the southern kingdom of Judah, you have Hezekiah who's described as a godly king. He did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord. And he was so swept up in doing the right thing that he realized that they as a people had not been celebrating the Passover. And he wanted to correct that. And so he sent out a decree. He said, we're going to do this. And so everybody come, we're going to do this. We're going to get it right this time. And so he sent word out, invited those tribes that were on the other side of the Jordan River and all those that consider themselves in good relationship with Judah, the tribe of Judah and the Levites to come together to have this celebration. And what we read there was about getting rid of these other altars. And then when he brought everybody together, everyone had not had an opportunity to go through the ceremonial purification necessary to be able to take part in the Passover. That was all spelled out in the Mosaic Law. But that sense of urgency on Hezekiah's part was, he said, we have put this off long enough. And even though everybody hasn't jumped through all the right hoops, crossed the right T's and dotted the right I's, I'm going to ask God to forgive us of that and accept our offering to Him. And you heard what we read. That's exactly what they did. And God not only accepted their offering, honored their celebration of the Passover, but He provided healing to them as a people. Now, the message is not so much about the grace of God, that He was never more interested in keeping those 613 technical points of the law as He was the hearts of the people being right. A broken and contrite heart was more important to Him than technically being able to check off all of those 613 things, because technically they could get all those things right and yet have a heart that was not right toward Him. So that's this framework here in which God honors the faithful effort of King Hezekiah in this celebration of the Passover. And yet it says they remove these other altars and these places for burning incense. You read through, one of the things that you'll read through in all these kings of either kingdom are the names of the pagan gods that they were celebrated. Now, quite often there was the Baal, which was a common expression. But I think maybe more times than Baal was mentioned, was Asherah was mentioned, either as an object or as a pole. And you would see quite often when Israel would go astray and pursue other gods, they would be celebrating this pagan goddess, Asherah, symbolized by an image of a female, such as this. This is probably the cleanest one I can show you, because she was a goddess of fertility, very much akin to Isis in Egypt. Some of the images of her are very sexual in nature. But alongside of that was what was called an Asherah pole. I'm not going to belabor that, and there's not really an easy way to say this other than an Asherah pole in conjunction with an object like this idol of her was a phallus. And a phallus was not just a common object in the ancient world, but it's a common object in our world that's associated with both nationality and religion. You find one of these in St. Peter's Cathedral outside of the Basilica in Rome that stands there. We have one in Washington, D.C. that's right there in the center of the mall area between the Lincoln Memorial and the Capitol building. You have what we call the Washington Monument. That is a phallus. It is supposed to be representative of male fertility. Enough said about that. The ancient world was caught up in that. You can't find many ancient civilizations and culture that they may not have been depictions of this particular goddess and this particular object that was associated with that, but you find this replete. It was true in Pompeii when Pompeii was when the ash was removed from that volcanic eruption that destroyed that place. This was replete in the architecture there. It was very graphic in that world, in that context. And so the world, the ancient world, the Old Testament world, where Israel had the option to either get it right or get it wrong, when a king did what was right, they would dispose of these objects and what they represented. And when they did what was wrong, they would replace them, and it became a place of offering sacrifices to this goddess and really celebrating this aspect of humanity, the sexual nature of humanity, and making it the peak and the pinnacle of everything they were about. And it played a large role in either God's pleasure or displeasure with them as a people. And it was within the framework of that, when Hezekiah came to the throne, that had been a part of the history of Israel up until that time. And he set about to do the right thing, and knowing that when he was done and his successor came along and his successor came along, this continued to be a problem with ancient Israel. Their paganism, their watching and worshiping strange gods, so much so that they were finally sent into Babylonian captivity. And they never fully recovered even after that in the restoration of the temple until they went into oblivion as a nation and were rebirthed during some of our lifetimes back in the 40s. So I'm taking this that I'm reading from Tom Rogerson about the nuns in our culture. I'm doing my reading in the Old Testament. I'm looking at life, what is going on politically with us right now, what is going on nationally, the trends and the patterns, and those things that frankly just make me ill because I see really a replay of ancient history. That this skewed emphasis on sexuality was at the heart of paganism in the ancient world. The only thing that might have been more detestable than how this was played out was in the offering of babies to the god Molech. They would actually take infants and sacrifice them to this god. And then they would try to incorporate human intimacy into religious worship with both female and male temple prostitutes. And you will find the evidence in Scripture is that it never made God happy, and He always punished them for that. Yet here we are in 2023, where just this past week, a congressman reprimanded somebody who spoke and expressed their Christian faith and their belief that Jesus was the answer. And this person called that anti-Semitic and condemned her and criticized her for having done that. And some of his colleagues are calling for him to be censored, and yet that's where we are. So when I sit down at lunchtime during my daily schedule here, I'll turn on YouTube and I'll look at some people and some content there, because I'm wanting to have a sort of a greater view of what's going on in life than what I have from my seat here or from my house. And YouTube is a principal vehicle for doing that. And so I switch over and I saw the name Richard Dawkins, and I'm familiar with him because he is one of the more famous atheist that's alive today. He's a British biologist. For him, evolution is his religion. He has no use for God. He wrote a book, became famous, called The God Delusion. He's been very, not just not believing in a belief in God, but he's been very antagonistic, militantly antagonistic for people of faith, making fun of them and mocking them. So anyway, I saw where he was doing this interview, and so I thought, well, I've never really watched him outside of maybe a debate context with some believer, and having read a number of his things. And so he was interviewing a lady by the name of Helen Joyce, and he has a YouTube channel, and so I went there and watched him, and here he is, and here she is. And what he wanted to talk to her about, she's an author. She was a journalist who wrote this book about the trans phenomenon that we've spoke about in recent days, and you know my view on that. It's absolutely revolting. The disposition and the attitude, the tyranny of the minority over the rest of us, the lack of backbone that people in positions of responsibility are lacking to stand up against this, whether it's in a school or university or a library or in a public forum. And so Richard Dawkins, as a biologist, he comes out and says there is no such thing as trans. He says biology is determined by X and Y chromosomes. So you're either male or you are female. There is no such thing as trans. And so he asked this author who had done her research on this subject and written this book on it. And so they had this interesting discourse. And I'm thinking, well, that's pretty interesting that this is one time when Richard Dawkins and I would be in complete and absolute agreement. But as I listened to them, I got some insight from some other sources, but they talked about this problem that existed when you're trying to make something that it cannot be. That a man cannot be. An X will never become a Y, and a Y will never become an X. And yet in the midst of this, they both agreed that a lot of families would be much happier if their children were trans than if they were homosexual. And I'm going, well, that's a really great choice there. I don't want them to be homosexual, but I'm okay with them being gender confused. And I got to thinking about this Old Testament world where these kings are coming and going, and a big part of the worship that Israel would fall into was this worship in a skewed version of human sexuality. So if anything, I would refer to today's lesson as the new Asherah, because I see that as where we are. So having watched this, a reference was made to a young man by the name of David Reimer. He was born as Bruce in 1965. He had a twin brother, and when they were 8 months old, their parents took them to have them circumcised. And the doctor used the wrong piece of equipment for circumcision and botched it on young Bruce, so much so that he essentially destroyed his male sex organ. And he was in a quandary. The parents were in a quandary. Well, what do we do now? And there was a doctor at Johns Hopkins University, John Money, it's spelled M-O-N-E-Y, who was a surgeon who believed that you could change the gender of a child. You could take and raise a male child as a female and in effect turn them into a female. And he convinced the parents that this was their best course of action, would take Bruce, completely neuter him, put him on hormone therapy, and raise him as a girl, and not tell him till absolutely necessary that that's what had happened. And so that's what they did. And it was hailed as a medical miracle and success. And people began to buy into that notion that gender is fluid. And it's not so much about genetics as it's about environment, being raised, how you're being raised. So I went back and I saw some interviews with Bruce, and I read from his parents and said that while they put him in girl clothes and they gave him dolls to play with and they referred to him as she, they thought that this would completely alter the chemistry of the brain and everything else, and he would never know different. And they called him Brenda. But even as a young child, just learning to walk, just learning to go to the bathroom, quite often Bruce would want to stand up to relieve himself. He wanted to take off his girl clothes and put on boy clothes. And so he was treated this way until he became an adolescent. And finally, when his parents told him what had happened, he said, "I'm a boy. I have never been a girl." And yet that experiment, that surgical butchering of that child was hailed by those who have bought into a modern Asherah in their thinking. That what the Bible has to say, or what God has to say about our identity and our natures and our gender, is irrelevant, because it's simply a matter of our choosing. The sad footnote is that when he became a boy, he chose the name David for himself, went on to try to have a life, but eventually he committed suicide. So here we are in 2023. The church trying to be the church. Christ followers trying to live out their faith in a culture that is now becoming hostile to it. I saw or read an article that two women athletes were speaking at a public event at a local library in favor of protecting women's sports, not allowing biological males to participate in women's sports. And the person in charge of the library interrupted the thing and says, you can't talk about biological males. You've got to stop doing that. And they shut the event down and kicked them out of the library. That this madness, this insanity that's overtaken our culture, that's causing people to be afraid to stand up and speak up. And I'm disturbed by the lack of courage. And I'm encouraged by the lack of courage by some that are willing to take the slings and arrows of a culture that's gone insane. The new Asherah is this subject matter here. Not recognizing the uniqueness of what God created in a man and in a woman. So much so that there's not a satisfaction or contentment for everybody to have their own opinions, but it has to be forced upon the rest of us. That I understand that CNN has produced a dictionary, a syllabus of pronouns, so that you use the proper pronoun with everybody that you're talking to, and if not, you're breaking the law. Canada under Trudeau, their prime minister, has made it illegal for somebody not to use the preferred pronoun of somebody who is worshiping at this idol of Asherah in our day. Is it any wonder that our country is in a mess across the board? I mean, it's all tied to this denial, number one, that there's an absolute giver of right and wrong in morality, but there's such thing as absolute right and wrong. The encouraging thing is that at any given time, like in Hezekiah's day, or in the few other kings that were before him and after him, that decided to do it right, as soon as they dispensed with these idols to, in their case, was idols to fertility. In our case, it's idols to sexuality. Unnatural sexuality. That when they got it right, that God would restore them as a people and would at least honor the culture and the health of the citizens during the reign of that king. But ultimately it cost them the kingdom. So when things roll around in the New Testament times and Paul comes to write the book of Romans in the second chapter, he talks about these people who chose not to retain the knowledge of God but gave themselves over to the passions of the lust, defiling God's X and God's Y, and saying that it's mix and match, it's choose what you want, because it's entirely up to us and God accepts us all. So you have on the one end, you have those of us who are saying there is good and there is evil, there is right, there is wrong, there is male, there is female, and there is that place of God's blessing on us, not just individually, but collectively, when together we do those right things. You have on the other end those that say it's a delusion, it's a religious delusion. It's like an opiate that Marx would say of religion in general. That all of this is fluid. I even heard or even read a case where I think it was a teacher that this whole identity thing said it was okay for a child to identify as candy. This is a slippery slope that I don't want to find out where it goes to. Because I've seen where it is. I see what our children, what our grandchildren are facing with. And the hope is that there's something can be done to arrest this before it's too late. There are those that hold to a view that before Jesus comes back, there will be a worldwide revival. I hope they're accurate. I don't share their confidence in the biblical accounts, the prophetic accounts, that would indicate that that is the case. There's something to be said for where Scripture talks about it getting worse and worse until the end comes. So I'm left to ponder, in our time together, as I read Scriptures, I read news, as I watch what's going on, as I'm putting those environment in context. And thankfully, I'm not one of those people. My wife and I watch some historical stuff. And whether it's watching stuff about racism in America from back in the 50s and the 60s, and even some places now, or it's watching the treatment of Israel when Israel was rebirthed as a nation in 1949, and the prejudice, the anti-Semitism that they have endured over time. And my wife and I talk about it. It makes us angry. And I know I'm one of those people, were I in one of those contexts, I'd probably be dead because somebody had put me out of their misery. Because I simply cannot not do something or not say something and say, stop, time out. If you want to go do that, you go do that. But don't force that on the rest of us who do not buy into that. I think one of the statements that I made a few weeks back was that those that are pushing this new Asherah culture, is that they either have issues personally to where that is their inclination, or they have somebody close in their family. Therefore, they're trying to create a context and an environment where it's acceptable for the unacceptable to exist. It is why we define wokeism as normalizing perversion. And it even happens with people. It's why we go into a state of justification. We rationalize conduct and behavior and attitudes and actions and words before we do them, building our own case for being able to do them. And then once we've done them, then we spend the rest of the time trying to justify that, trying to cover our sin, trying to cover our fault, trying to make it okay. And I see this as the climax of that. That to say, if everything is permissible, then no one can be guilty of sin. And yet there's not a contentment with that, because the people who have bought into the new Asherah are unwilling to say, live and let live. But if we don't subscribe and encourage and promote their position, then we are guilty of sin, because we're not being inclusive. One of the things I saw or I read or I heard, and I don't remember the source of this, it was probably in a detransitioner. A detransitioner is a person who went through that state of confusion, thought that was okay, that was acceptable, that was right, and they bought into that narrative and into that kind of treatment, only to realize that it was a personal disaster. They allowed themselves to be altered forever. I heard that if you put a child on puberty blockers in infancy, by the time they're 20 years old, there's no reversing that. They will be sterile, incapable of producing offspring. But anyway, one of these detransitioners, and they come back and they say it was a mistake, it was wrong, I don't think we should be doing this or permitting this. But talked about being in a school that was considered a progressive school, and that the teachers in that school encouraged every student to either be homosexual or to be trans. That it was not natural to be normal. Bowing down at the new altar of Asherah. So it's no surprise that in one of the things that I read or I watched recently was I came across this, that Barack Obama swept into office. He was the one who began promoting the new Asherah. And his vice president has continued to do the same. And I always wondered, what was the driving force behind that, based on my theory about where people are? And as it turns out, I knew without knowing, that housed in Emory University are a set of letters that were written by him when he was dating this lady here, Alex McNeil. You can see she's not African American. They actually lived together while he was in the university. And my understanding is that they broke it off because he came under the influence of Jeremiah Wright, the African American pastor, that used very offensive language in one of his sermons some years ago when Obama was swept into office. That when Obama did his memoirs, I don't know what the title of it is, but the guy who helped him do that, he told this sort of ghostwriter that he had written a number of letters to this girlfriend, that she'd kept those, and that they're housed in the Emory University library. And he was hoping that no one would ever read them. Guess what? They have been read. And in it, Mr. Obama admits to his then girlfriend that daily he fantasized about being intimate with men. I'm not sharing that for shock value. I am repulsed by the spiritual arrogance of a culture and a generation of people who, frankly, say to hell with God, and that you can do whatever you want to do, and there is no piper to pay. So where does that leave us? It's not a very encouraging message here. I realize that. But I know that this is what we're confronted with. So whether you're Roy Meadows in Katy, Texas, or whether you're D.K. Hale in Canada, or whether you're, whoever you happen to be that may be tuning into this, we all have a challenge. Because our challenge to be like Jesus in this culture too. In a culture where we can be despised and hated and rejected and criticized, and yes, even jailed, because we're unwilling to bow at the altar of Asherah and Asherah poles. And so our challenge is to retain dignity and a godly disposition. To say it doesn't matter how nasty or how ugly or how repulsive or repugnant the whole world and environment becomes, we have a call to be just like Jesus. To be able to look at somebody and say, your sin is deplorable, but the love of God has been poured out for you that you might have new life and forgiveness if you're willing just to admit that you need Jesus. Turn from your sin and have life eternal and peace in abundance. It strikes me as curious that the very thing that people say they're looking for as they're pursuing this is the very thing that's driving them away from the source in which they can have it. I think this harkens back to, I guess Billy Graham. He probably didn't originate this, but I'll give him credit for it. When he became famous as an evangelist and he talked about us being created with this God-shaped vacuum in our heart, that's all we're talking about here. Is that you're born with this God-shaped vacuum, and you will spend a life trying to find something to fill that. You're looking for something that's going to give satisfaction and peace and joy and encouragement and contentment and meaning and purpose in life. And when you're put in a cultural context that's saying, try this, try this, try this, try this, and none of them have anything to do with seeking out God, then that hole gets stuffed full of other things until it corrodes the soul. And statistically speaking, if you take everyone who walks through any one of those Asherah doors, you will find the highest rate of suicides in any class or group of people that there is. And that's because going after that which can never satisfy that void in the heart only leaves somebody to absolute utter despair. And without the message of hope and encouragement that if they just turn from that and embrace the love of God in Christ Jesus, they can have fulfillment and they can have purpose and they can have joy and they can have peace. The challenge of the church in our day is to be that lighthouse that proclaims the truth, but to do so in love with grace. So much easier to do one of these kind of things than to do one of these kind of things. To sit down and listen to people and say, well, tell me about this. Don't try to reprogram their brain, but try to introduce them to the life-giving message of hope in Jesus Christ. This is sort of my final word in trying to think through what Tom Rogerson says about the nuns, about this culture and the climate that we're stuck in and having to watch and listen and be bombarded every day and told how wrong and how hateful that we are because we will not sign off on somebody else's insanity. What can I say? My mind is racing to say I am challenged too. So let me hear from you. Let me hear from you. You can reach out to me at this email address, correspond with me. I'll be glad to respond to you if you have questions or comments or observations. How to have a positive message and a positive attitude in a corrupt and corrupting environment where people aren't really interested in what we have to share. But to earn that right, that we have come to this place because I'm convinced that generation after generation after generation has not lived out fully what Jesus is about. So it's so discredited the good news of Jesus Christ that we get down to this point where so many people will say, I'm a none of the above. I believe that there's some form of spirituality, but I'm not sure who to believe because all the sources I look and listen to seem to be unreliable and inconsistent in what they say and in what they do. Thank you for your support, your prayer support. Thank you for the many congratulations we received from many of you for having Sarah and I having celebrated our 47th wedding anniversary. I should say my celebrating our 47th wedding anniversary and her celebrating 47 years of grace. I got all the messages. Thank you kindly for your comments and your reflections. Thank you for those of you who support our ministry financially, that we can keep doing what we're doing and looking for new venues and opportunities to reach out and bless others through your faithful giving. If you want to do it old school, you know, the electronic ways, or I can help you do that, then simply mail a check to Church Rebirth Ministries Incorporated, mail it to this address. We're a 501c3 and be glad to send you a record of your contributions at the end of the year. Pray for me as I try to figure out what I'm supposed to do and to be without getting killed in the process, to live and do as long as God enables me so I can see as many people as possible, have the light come on for them, and experience the freedom and the joy and the peace that's in Jesus Christ. God bless you until next week. I guess we could call this the epilogue. Well, I'm having my quiet time this morning, having shot the video yesterday, having edited it, but having to come back and add this annotation. Because this is what I read this morning in 2 Chronicles chapter 31, just sort of to say, how do you like them apples after yesterday's time together? Verse 1, when this was over, all the Israelites who were there went to the cities in Judah. They crushed the sacred stones, cut down the poles dedicated to the goddess Asherah, and tore down the illegal places of worship and the altars throughout Judah, Benjamin, Ephraim, and Manasseh. The Israelites destroyed all these things. Then all the Israelites returned to their own cities. Each person went to his own property. Nice footnote to our time yesterday. Have a great day.